September 22, 1914, Wilhelmshaven Naval Base, Germany. The night watch officer aboard the Imperial German Navy cruiser Hela squinted through the darkness at what appeared to be a piece of driftwood floating past the harbor entrance. He watched it for perhaps 30 seconds before dismissing it and returning to his rounds. What he had actually seen was the periscope of His Majesty's submarine E9, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Max Horton, quietly slipping past the most heavily defended naval base in Germany. Inside the submarine's cramped control room, Horton whispered orders to his crew as they navigated by dead reckoning through a minefield that German intelligence believed made the harbor approach absolutely impenetrable. The mathematics of this mission were simple and terrifying. One mistake in navigation meant hitting a mine. One careless sound meant detection by patrol boats. One moment of bad luck meant the deaths of all 30 men crammed into a steel tube just beneath the surface. But what German planners had never considered was that a British submarine commander might be reckless enough to attempt the impossible. The First World War had been raging for barely 7 weeks. But the German high seas fleet had already established itself as the most powerful naval force in the North Sea. Wilhelmshaven represented the crown jewel of German naval power, home to dozens of warships protected by minefields, patrol boats, coastal artillery, and the absolute confidence that no enemy could possibly penetrate their defenses. That confidence was about to be shattered by a submarine commander who believed that the best place to hunt warships was inside the enemy's own harbor. This is the story of how British audacity and German overconfidence collided in one of the most daring submarine operations of the First World War. How a single submarine commander rewrote the rules of naval warfare by proving that no harbor was safe, no defense impenetrable, and no fleet truly secure. The mission would transform Max Horton from an unconventional junior officer into a legend whose tactics would influence submarine warfare for generations. But on that September morning, as E9 crept past sleeping sentries and anchored warships, all that mattered was survival for the next 5 minutes. The story begins not in the cramped confines of a submarine, but in the comfortable offices of the Admiralty in London, where the opening weeks of the war had delivered a series of humiliating shocks to British naval pride. The Royal Navy, which had ruled the waves for 2 centuries, discovered that the Germans had built a fleet specifically designed to challenge British supremacy. Worse still, the Germans were using their naval bases at Wilhelmshaven, Cuxhaven, and Helgoland as fortresses from which they could raid British shipping with near impunity before retreating behind seemingly impregnable defenses. First Sea Lord Prince Louis of Battenberg faced a strategic nightmare. The Grand Fleet, Britain's main battle force, was stationed at Scapa Flow in Scotland, too far north to intercept German raiders before they struck. Surface ships couldn't approach the German coast without running into minefields. Destroyers couldn't penetrate harbor defenses. The German high seas fleet could sortie when it chose, attack where it wanted, and retreat to safety before British capital ships arrived. But there was one weapon the Germans hadn't fully considered: the submarine. In 1914, submarines were still experimental, unreliable, and generally considered unsuitable for anything beyond coastal defense. The Royal Navy had built its E-class submarines as something of an afterthought, vessels that most senior officers viewed with suspicion, if not outright contempt. These boats were small, cramped, dangerous to their own crews, and limited in range. Most importantly, there was no established doctrine for their use in offensive operations. Lieutenant Commander Max Horton was exactly the sort of officer who thrived in the absence of doctrine. Born in 1883 to a middle-class family in Cheshire, Horton had joined the Royal Navy at 13 and quickly established himself as brilliant, unconventional, and utterly fearless. By 1914, at just 31 years old, he commanded HMS E9, one of the newer boats in the submarine flotilla based at Harwich. Horton's executive officer, Lieutenant Hugh Vaughan, later recalled his commander's reaction when the Admiralty issued general orders for submarine operations in the Heligoland Bight. Most captains interpreted these orders as authorization for cautious patrols well outside German territorial waters. Horton read them as permission to do whatever he deemed necessary. When Vaughan suggested that approaching German harbors might be suicidal, Horton reportedly smiled and said that was precisely why the Germans wouldn't expect it. HMS E9 was a marvel of early 20th century engineering, though her crew might have used different words to describe her. At 178 feet long and displacing 800 tons submerged, she was considerably larger than earlier British submarines. Her diesel engines could push her to 15 knots on the surface, while electric motors provided a submerged speed of 9 knots for perhaps 2 hours before the batteries died. The boat carried 5 18-inch torpedo tubes, 2 forward and 3 in the beam, with a total of 10 torpedoes. Each torpedo was 18 feet long, weighed 1,600 pounds, and packed 300 pounds of high explosive in its warhead. The torpedoes were temperamental, sometimes running too deep, sometimes failing to explode, and occasionally running in circles to attack the submarine that fired them. But when they worked, they could sink a battleship. Living conditions aboard E9 defied modern comprehension. 30 men shared a space, smaller than most London flats, with no privacy, minimal sanitation, and air that quickly became foul with the smell of diesel fuel, battery acid, unwashed bodies, and bilge water. The crew slept in hammocks strung between pipes and machinery. They ate cold food because cooking produced smoke and smells that might be detected. Fresh water was too precious to waste on washing, yet these men volunteered for submarine service, drawn by extra pay and the promise of adventure. Able seaman William Webb, who served aboard E9 throughout her career, wrote in his memoir that submarine crews were a special breed. You had to be slightly mad to climb into a steel coffin and deliberately sink beneath the waves, he noted. But you also had to trust your mates, absolutely. One man's mistake killed everyone. On September 6, 1914, just 5 weeks after Britain entered the war, Horton took E9 out of Harwich Harbour on what was officially described as a routine patrol. The official orders from Commodore Roger Keyes, commanding the submarine flotilla, authorized operations in the Heligoland Bight to interdict German shipping and gather intelligence. What Keyes didn't know was that Horton had obtained detailed charts of Wilhelmshaven's defenses from a German merchant captain who had been interned at the outbreak of war. The journey from Harwich to the German coast took 2 days of careful navigation. E9 traveled on the surface at night to conserve battery power and recharge, diving before dawn to avoid German patrols. The North Sea in September was typically rough, with gray skies and choppy seas that made navigation challenging. Inside the submarine, the crew endured constant motion, sleeping when they could, eating cold tinned food, and waiting for action. Horton shared his actual plan with only 2 men, his executive officer Vaughan and his coxswain, Chief Petty Officer Thomas Summers. The rest of the crew believed they were conducting a standard patrol. Horton's reasoning was simple. If the mission failed and E9 was captured, the Germans would torture his crew for information. What they didn't know couldn't be extracted. On September 21st, E9 reached the approaches to Wilhelmshaven. Through his periscope, Horton studied the German defenses with professional appreciation. The harbor entrance was protected by 2 lines of contact mines anchored at varying depths. Patrol boats swept the approaches every 4 hours. Coastal artillery batteries commanded the harbor mouth with overlapping fields of fire. Searchlights probed the darkness at irregular intervals. The defenses had been designed by German naval engineers who assumed no sane enemy would attempt penetration. They hadn't accounted for Max Horton. That evening, surfaced under cover of darkness, Horton briefed his crew on what they were about to attempt. Several men went pale. One rating asked if the commander was joking. Horton assured them he was deadly serious and gave any man who wished the option to transfer to the deck of a passing British destroyer that was shadowing them. Not one man accepted. At 10 o'clock that night, E9 submerged and began her approach. Horton had studied the tidal charts obsessively. He knew that at this hour, the falling tide created a current that flowed out of the harbor at 2 knots. His plan was to use that current, drifting with the outflow while maintaining just enough power to steer. The submarine would be nearly silent, presenting minimal wake or disturbance to alert sentries. Navigating a submerged submarine through a minefield in darkness, using nothing but dead reckoning and a compass, represented seamanship of the highest order. Horton had calculated the position of the mine lines based on his captured charts and observations of German patrol patterns. He knew the mines were anchored at depths between 15 and 40 feet. He took E9 down to 60 feet, betting that the Germans had assumed no submarine would operate that deep so close to harbor. The tension inside the submarine was suffocating. Every man understood that mines could be dragged deeper by currents or ships passing overhead. Every creak of the hull sounded like impending disaster. Horton stood at the periscope station, occasionally raising the scope for 3-second looks before snapping it down. Each periscope observation risked detection, but without them, he was navigating blind. At 11:45, Horton raised the periscope and saw what he'd been hoping for, the dark bulk of the harbor mole, the stone breakwater protecting the anchorage. They had made it through the minefield. E9 was inside German territorial waters, inside the defensive perimeter, inside what the German Navy considered absolutely secure space. Now came the dangerous part. Wilhelmshaven in September 1914 housed a significant portion of the high seas fleet. Intelligence reports suggested at least 2 battleships, multiple cruisers, and numerous destroyers and support vessels. But Horton wasn't interested in battleships. They were too large, too well protected, and their loss, while significant, wouldn't fundamentally change German naval strategy. What Horton wanted was targets that would cause maximum psychological damage while being militarily achievable. He wanted ships whose destruction would prove that nowhere was safe, that the vaunted German harbor defenses were useless against a determined attacker. He wanted the Germans to lose sleep, wondering if British submarines were hiding in their anchorages. Through the periscope, he conducted a slow sweep of the harbor. The anchorage was dimly lit, with only a few lamps burning aboard the anchored vessels. Most crews were asleep, confident in their security. Horton could make out the silhouettes of warships against the slightly lighter sky. A heavy cruiser at 2 o'clock, 3 destroyers nested together at 10 o'clock, and there, directly ahead, the distinctive profile of a light cruiser. The ship was SMS Hela, a 2,000-ton light cruiser launched in 1912. She wasn't the most powerful ship in the harbor, but she was perfect for Horton's purposes. Small enough that his torpedoes would sink her, large enough that her loss would be significant, and positioned perfectly for an attack. Horton called his torpedo officer forward. Lieutenant Richard Sanford studied the target through the periscope and calculated firing solutions. The range was approximately 800 yards. The angle was nearly perfect, a 90-degree shot at a stationary target. Under normal circumstances, this would be the easiest torpedo shot imaginable, but circumstances were far from normal. The confined waters of the harbor meant limited room for the torpedoes to arm themselves. The shallow depth meant the torpedoes might run aground or porpoise on the surface. The proximity to other ships meant noise from the torpedo tubes would alert multiple vessels simultaneously. And once the first torpedo left the tube, E9 would have perhaps 5 minutes before every ship in the harbor was hunting her. Horton made his decision. He would fire 2 torpedoes in quick succession, then dive deep and run for the harbor entrance at maximum speed. Speed and surprise were his only advantages. Once the Germans realized a British submarine was inside their base, those advantages would evaporate. At 12:15 in the morning on September 22, 1914, Horton gave the order. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as compressed air expelled the first torpedo from the forward tube. 15 seconds later, fire 2. The second torpedo followed the first. Inside E9, every man held his breath. The torpedoes, driven by compressed air engines, left trails of bubbles as they ran toward their target at 40 knots. Time seemed to stretch impossibly. 40 seconds, 50 seconds. Horton kept his eye pressed to the periscope, watching the dark shape of Hela. At 62 seconds, a massive explosion lit up the harbor. The first torpedo had struck Hela amidships, detonating against her hull below the waterline. Before the shockwave even dissipated, the second torpedo hit further aft, nearly breaking the cruiser in half. The combined force of 600 pounds of high explosive opening Hela's hull like a tin can. Through the periscope, Horton watched the cruiser heel violently to port. Her back broken by the second explosion, Hela began sinking immediately. Men poured onto her deck in nightclothes, scrambling for the boats as their ship went down beneath them. The entire sinking took less than 3 minutes. All hell broke loose in Wilhelmshaven. Searchlights snapped on across the harbor. Ships rang alarm bells. Destroyers cut their anchor cables and got underway. Shore batteries began firing blindly into the darkness. And somewhere in that chaos, E9 was diving deep and running for her life. Horton took the submarine down to 90 feet, far deeper than was considered safe, and called for maximum speed. The electric motors screamed as they pushed the boat through the dark water. Inside the submarine, the crew could hear the sounds of chaos overhead. Propellers thrashing as destroyers hunted them. The distinctive ping of early sonar systems searching. Depth charges beginning to explode. The German response was immediate but chaotic. No British submarine had ever penetrated the harbor defenses. German officers had no doctrine for responding to such an attack. Destroyers raced about dropping depth charges randomly, as likely to damage friendly vessels as hit the submarine. Patrol boats swept the harbor entrance, but Horton had anticipated this. Instead of heading directly for the exit, he steered E9 south, parallel to the shore, moving away from where the Germans expected him to be. For 2 hours, E9 crept along the bottom of Wilhelmshaven harbor while German ships hunted overhead. The crew endured terrifying conditions. Carbon dioxide built up in the confined space, making breathing difficult. Battery power dwindled toward dangerously low levels. Every explosion made men flinch, wondering if the next one would breach the hull. Chief Petty Officer Summers later described those hours as the longest of his life. You couldn't see anything, couldn't do anything, could only sit there and hope the hull held. Some of the younger lads were praying. Others were writing final letters to their families. The skipper just stood there calm as you please, calculating courses and making decisions like we were on a Sunday afternoon cruise. At 2:30 in the morning, Horton made his move. German search patterns had become predictable, focused on the direct route to the harbor mouth. He brought E9 to periscope depth and observed a gap in the patrol pattern. For perhaps 5 minutes, the approach to the harbor entrance would be clear. He surfaced the submarine and opened the main diesel engines at full power. E9 burst from the water like a whale, her diesels roaring as she accelerated toward the harbor mouth. For 2 minutes, she raced across the surface at 15 knots, her wake phosphorescent in the darkness. German lookouts spotted her immediately. Searchlights pinned the submarine in brilliant illumination. Shore batteries opened fire, sending shells screaming across the water. But hitting a small, fast-moving target in darkness proved nearly impossible. Geysers of water erupted around E9 as shells fell wide. One round struck the water 10 feet from the submarine's starboard side, close enough that shrapnel rang against the hull. Then they were past the harbor mole and into open water. Horton crash-dived the submarine as German destroyers roared out in pursuit. But E9 had a head start and a commander who knew every trick of submarine warfare. Horton took her deep, changed course underwater, and when he surfaced 20 minutes later, the German destroyers were searching in completely the wrong direction. By dawn on September 22nd, HMS E9 was 40 miles from Wilhelmshaven, running on the surface toward British waters. Behind her, the German Navy was in chaos. Hela lay on the bottom of the harbor, her entire crew rescued, but the ship a total loss. More significantly, the psychological impact was devastating. If one British submarine could penetrate Wilhelmshaven's defenses, what was to stop others? The German naval staff immediately ordered changes to harbor security. Additional mines were laid, patrol schedules were increased, anti-submarine nets were strung across the harbor mouth. But the damage to German confidence was done. The supposedly impregnable naval bases were revealed as vulnerable. German admirals began questioning whether their ships were even safe at anchor. When E9 arrived back at Harwich on September 24th, Commodore Keyes was furious. Horton had vastly exceeded his orders, risking his submarine and crew on what could easily have been a suicide mission. But the Admiralty in London saw things differently. First, Sea Lord Winston Churchill, who appreciated bold action, recommended Horton for immediate promotion and decoration. The official report of the action, filed by Horton and preserved in the National Archives, was characteristically understated. Proceeded to Wilhelmshaven as ordered, observed enemy cruiser at anchor, engaged and sank said cruiser, returned to base. The report made no mention of penetrating minefields, navigating a hostile harbor in darkness, or the desperate escape under fire. But word spread quickly through the Royal Navy. Horton's exploit became legendary, inspiring other submarine commanders to attempt similarly aggressive operations. Within weeks, British submarines were regularly penetrating German coastal waters, sinking merchant ships, attacking patrols, and generally making the German Navy's life miserable. The impact on German naval strategy was profound. The High Seas Fleet, which had planned to aggressively challenge British naval supremacy, became increasingly cautious. German admirals, aware that British submarines might be lurking anywhere, kept their capital ships in port more often. The Kaiser himself, horrified by the thought of losing a battleship to a submarine torpedo, issued orders restricting the fleet's movements. Hela's sinking had another effect that neither side anticipated. It established the template for submarine warfare that would dominate both world wars. Horton had proven that submarines weren't merely coastal defense vessels, but offensive weapons capable of projecting power into enemy waters. His tactics, penetrating defenses through stealth and attacking from positions the enemy considered secure, became standard doctrine. The crew of E9 received a hero's welcome when they returned to Britain. Able seaman Webb wrote that they couldn't buy their own drinks in any pub near Harwich. Everyone wanted to hear about the raid. Most of the crew, sworn to secrecy by the Admiralty, could only smile and say they'd had an interesting patrol. Max Horton received the Distinguished Service Order, one of the Royal Navy's highest decorations. But the recognition he valued most came from his fellow submarine commanders, who began calling their boats' most aggressive patrols "pulling a Horton." The phrase meant taking calculated risks, pressing attacks home regardless of danger, and trusting in skill and audacity to overcome numerical inferiority. Over the following months, E9 conducted several more aggressive patrols into German waters. In October, Horton sank the German destroyer S-126 off the Ems estuary. In December, he torpedoed a merchantman carrying coal to the high seas fleet. Each success further demonstrated that German coastal waters were no longer safe, that the Royal Navy could strike anywhere, anytime. But it was the Wilhelmshaven raid that defined Horton's career and legacy. The mission had been militarily successful, sinking a warship and forcing the Germans to divert resources to harbor defense. More importantly, it had been psychologically devastating, destroying German confidence in their defenses and establishing British submarines as a weapon the enemy genuinely feared. German records captured after the war revealed the extent of panic the raid caused. Immediately following Hela's sinking, the naval staff considered relocating the entire high seas fleet to Baltic ports, where British submarines couldn't reach. The idea was rejected as logistically impossible and strategically disastrous, but the fact that senior officers seriously discussed it showed how deeply one submarine's raid had shaken German naval confidence. Kapitän zur See Heinrich von Bönninghausen, who commanded the destroyer flotilla at Wilhelmshaven, wrote in his private diary that the night Hela was sunk was the worst of his career. "We thought we were safe," he noted. "We believed our defenses were impenetrable. One British submarine proved us fatally wrong. Now every unexplained noise in the harbor causes panic. Officers who previously slept peacefully in their bunks now pace the decks at night, staring into the darkness, wondering if tomorrow will bring another attack." The raid also forced Germany to deploy resources for harbor defense that could have been used elsewhere. Dozens of additional patrol boats were assigned to base security. Thousands of mines were laid in defensive lines. Anti-submarine nets and booms were installed at enormous expense. All of these measures drew resources from frontline operations, weakening Germany's ability to challenge British naval supremacy. Perhaps most significantly, the raid influenced German submarine doctrine in ways the British couldn't have anticipated. German U-boat commanders, studying Horton's success, adopted similarly aggressive tactics. They began penetrating British harbors, attacking ships in supposedly safe waters, and generally making life miserable for the Royal Navy. The unrestricted submarine warfare campaign that nearly brought Britain to her knees in 1917 was in many ways an evolution of tactics Horton pioneered in 1914. By the war's end, Max Horton had become one of the Royal Navy's most decorated submarine commanders. He sank 11 German warships and merchant vessels, survived dozens of depth charge attacks, and pioneered tactics that remained relevant through the Second World War. His aggressive leadership style inspired a generation of submarine officers who would fight in the next conflict. In 1940, as a full admiral, Horton took command of the western approaches during the Battle of the Atlantic. The desperate struggle to keep supply lines open to Britain, the same audacity and tactical brilliance he'd displayed as a young submarine commander, now served him well as a senior officer. His convoy tactics and aggressive use of hunter-killer groups were instrumental in defeating the U-boat threat. When asked late in life about the Wilhelmshaven raid, Horton allegedly said it was the easiest mission he'd ever conducted. "The The hard part was getting permission, he reportedly told an interviewer. Once you're inside enemy waters with a target in your sights, the decision is simple. You attack, anything else is overthinking. This attitude, this absolute confidence in aggressive action, defined Horton's career and influenced Royal Navy doctrine for decades. But it also represented something deeper about British naval culture in the First World War. The Royal Navy had ruled the seas for 2 centuries through a combination of superior ships, better training, and absolute determination to close with the enemy, regardless of odds. When new technology like submarines appeared, British officers didn't view them as replacement for traditional naval power, but as additional tools for achieving the same goal: fighting the enemy wherever he could be found and destroying his ability to wage war. Horton embodied this approach perfectly. He didn't see submarines as defensive weapons or commerce raiders. He saw them as warships capable of taking the fight directly to enemy bases. The contrast with German thinking was stark. German submarines were initially conceived as fleet auxiliaries, supporting the high seas fleet in major battles. German commanders were cautious, following strict orders and avoiding unnecessary risks. This caution, while sensible from a preservation of force perspective, meant German U-boats achieved far less in the early war than their British counterparts. It took the Germans until 1915 to adopt the aggressive commerce raiding tactics that British submarines had been using since the war's opening weeks. By then, Britain had established effective countermeasures and developed a doctrine for fighting submarines. The psychological advantage had been lost. The story of E-9C raid on Wilhelmshaven is ultimately a story about initiative, audacity, and the power of psychological warfare. Militarily, sinking one light cruiser didn't change the naval balance. The German high seas fleet remained a formidable threat. Wilhelmshaven remained operational as a naval base. The war would continue for 4 more years of bitter fighting. But psychologically, the raid achieved something far more significant. It demonstrated that Britain controlled the seas even in German home waters. It showed that aggressive leadership could overcome technological and numerical inferiority. It proved that no defense, however elaborate, could stop determined attackers willing to take calculated risks. These lessons resonated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Throughout the First World War, British submarines continued aggressive operations in German waters, sinking dozens of ships and forcing the enemy to divert enormous resources to defense. In the Second World War, British submarines and those of their allies would apply similar tactics against Axis shipping, strangling enemy supply lines and projecting power into hostile waters. The technical legacy of E-9's mission was equally significant. Horton's successful navigation of minefields using dead reckoning and periscope observations established procedures that remained standard until the advent of sonar and radar. His attack tactics, approaching from unexpected angles and firing multiple torpedoes in quick succession, became textbook examples taught to submarine officers in multiple navies. The human legacy might be most important. Max Horton demonstrated that junior officers, given appropriate freedom of action, could achieve results far beyond what cautious senior leadership might attempt. His example inspired aggressive, innovative thinking throughout the Royal Navy. Officers who served under Horton or studied his methods went on to command their own vessels, spreading his doctrine of aggressive action and calculated risk-taking. Chief Petty Officer Summers, Horton's coxswain on E-9, later commanded his own submarine in the Second World War. He credited Horton with teaching him that the worst thing a commander could do was nothing. The skipper always said that sitting still and playing safe was the surest way to get killed, Summers recalled in a 1953 interview. Better to attack and deal with consequences than wait for the enemy to act first. This philosophy, learned in the cramped confines of E-9 during desperate missions in German waters, influenced an entire generation of Royal Navy officers. When the Second World War came, Britain's submarine force was the most aggressive in the world, willing to take on any target in any waters. That tradition traced directly back to Max Horton and his raid on Wilhelmshaven. Today, HMS E-9's achievements are commemorated at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport. Her battle flag, showing 11 enemy ships sunk, hangs alongside those of more famous boats. A model of the submarine occupies a place of honor, its plaque describing the Wilhelmshaven raid as one of the most daring operations in submarine history. German records of the raid preserved in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg tell the other side of the story. Reports from Wilhelmshaven describe chaos, confusion, and dawning horror as officers realized their defenses had been penetrated. One report notes that morale among the high seas fleet suffered noticeably after the raid, with crews expressing concern about the effectiveness of harbor security. The loss of Hela herself was relatively minor in material terms. Germany had dozens of light cruisers and could absorb the loss of one without significant impact on operations. But the manner of her loss, torpedoed at anchor inside supposedly secure waters, created psychological damage that far exceeded the military loss. Every subsequent German naval operation had to account for the possibility of British submarines operating in areas previously considered safe. This uncertainty forced conservative decision-making at every level. Admirals hesitated to commit ships to operations that might expose them to submarine attack. Captains kept their vessels at higher states of readiness, even in harbor, exhausting crews. Resources flowed into defensive measures rather than offensive capabilities, all because one submarine commander had proven that audacity could overcome any defense. The mathematics of Max Horton's raid were simple. One submarine, 30 men, 2 torpedoes, and unlimited courage achieved what entire fleets could not. They penetrated enemy defenses, destroyed enemy ships, and, most importantly, shattered enemy confidence. They proved that Britain's naval dominance extended even into German territorial waters, that no harbor was safe, that the Royal Navy would fight anywhere, anytime, against any odds. In an era of total war, when nations committed their entire populations and economies to victory, such demonstrations of resolve had strategic value beyond immediate military results. They showed friend and enemy alike that Britain would not surrender control of the seas, would not accept defensive postures, would not yield to any threat. This determination, embodied by officers like Max Horton and crews like that of E9, ultimately decided the naval war. September 22, 1914 was the day the German Navy learned that Britannia still ruled the waves, even in German harbors. It was the day Max Horton and HMS E9 demonstrated that courage, skill, and audacity could overcome any odds. It was the day that changed submarine warfare forever. In the cramped control room of a submarine lying on the bottom of a hostile harbor, surrounded by enemy warships, hunted by destroyers and depth charges, Max Horton had made the decision that defined his career: not to run, not to hide, but to attack, to close with the enemy and destroy him, regardless of danger, regardless of odds, regardless of consequences. That decision and the success that followed echoed through the decades that followed. Every submarine commander who pressed home an attack against overwhelming opposition, every officer who chose aggressive action over cautious defense, every sailor who trusted in skill and courage to overcome material disadvantage followed in the wake of HMS E9. The British submarine that slipped into a German harbor and sank a flagship while sitting still didn't just win a tactical victory. It established a tradition, created a legend, and proved that the most powerful weapon in any Navy's arsenal isn't steel or explosives, but the determination to use them without hesitation. Max Horton and his crew demonstrated that night that true naval power isn't measured in battleship tonnage or the thickness of harbor defenses. It's measured in the courage to enter enemy waters, face overwhelming odds, and emerge victorious through skill, determination, and absolute confidence in one's own abilities. That lesson, learned in the dark waters of Wilhelmshaven Harbor over a century ago, remains as relevant today as it was then. The British submarine that performed the impossible taught the world that no defense is impregnable to attackers bold enough to try.